Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Professor Kohei Saito. He is the author of the new book, Slow Down, the Degrowth Manifesto, available from Astra House. Professor Saito, thank you so much for joining us at Current Affairs today.
Thank you.
Well, let's begin with the crisis to which your book is a response. Could you maybe lay out for us the basics of what the kind of fundamental crisis that you are trying to address is?
Yes, the book discusses the fundamental crisis in the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is a geological epoch where the human activities, especially the economic activities, radically transformed our planet by massive consumption of fossil fuel, for example. So one of the representative crises of the Anthropocene is climate crisis. This crisis will be worse and worse in the coming decades, and this will create the increasing economic inequality and also resource scarcity, accelerating inflation, and that will also destabilize its geological order, leading to conflicts and war. So the crisis we are heading in the Anthropocene is a polycrisis, the combined crisis of capital accumulation, ecological crisis, crisis of democracy. So this is something that we didn't experience for many, many years. Maybe it's first time. So we need radical ideas to challenge this crisis.
Yeah, I mean, you point out, you use this term, I mean, perhaps some of our listeners have heard it before, perhaps some haven't, the Anthropocene, which is, I guess, used to refer to, we're used to these geological epochs, the Holocene and so forth, with the Anthropocene being this kind of era where, as I understand it, humans are so transforming the natural world that the world itself is now kind of defined by our relation to it. Perhaps you could tell us a little more about it.
Exactly. Because geology is usually considered as some kind of a natural formation, natural phenomena that has nothing to do with human activity. But the situation has completely changed because our economic activities have so much impact, building streets, building dams, radioactive waste, and so many things, plastics in the ocean. All these things created through our economic activities under capitalism had such a profound impact upon the entire ecosystem. So there is no nature as such anymore. Everything is mediated by our economic activity. This is the new age of Anthropocene. We are transforming the nature. We are transforming the planet.
Well, the most common response to this, I mean, there are a lot of people who will hear what you're saying, and they will agree with you that obviously human activity is causing a great deal of environmental breakdown. But their response will be, well, this is why we need sustainability. And they might point to, you start with the book by talking about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And what you argue is essentially that this idea of sustainability as the solution doesn't get us nearly close enough to understanding the deep roots of the crisis and what it will actually take to fix it. Why is that?
Yes, the ecological behavior often advocated in media is only about reducing our plastics and maybe using a little more bicycles, buying electric cars. And these are all reduced to individual behavior, the changing a little bit about your mode of behavior so that the earth will be more sustainable and so on. But what is ignored under such discourses, including SDGs, but also ESG and so on, this ecological crisis, for example, is not an individual issue. It is a system issue. So the Anthropocene is, I said, created through our economic activities, expanding economic activities. But this is also driven by capitalism. So capitalism as a system of constant profit making, and that is also accompanied by expanding production and consumption and waste, has profound impact on the planet. And if we don't challenge desire of infinite growth under capitalism, all the sustainable proposals are not effectively introduced.
Now, some people would say and have said that while it may be true that our current rate of growth is not sustainable, if we can, I believe the word used is decouple carbon emissions from economic growth, we could continue to have the growth of economic activity without necessarily destroying the precious planet that we happen to live on. And you critique that idea and you say, no, the entire model leads us inevitably towards disaster. Why is that?
Yeah, even some left-wing or liberal people also advocate, for example, for Green New Deal. That is also kind of based on the assumption that with the development of new technologies and there will be more jobs, and green growth is also possible. So we don't really have to challenge capitalism as such, or we don't have to give up economic growth thanks to new technologies, but we maybe need the intervention of the state in the market. So neoliberalism is bad, but capitalism as such is not necessarily evil. I argue a little bit different. Of course, neoliberalism is bad. It is, characterized by the increasing economic inequality, austerity, and more precarious job and so on. These things need to change. But at the same time, if we create better jobs, if we create more better energy system and so on, but at the same time, if we try to produce more and consume more, these things, the workers start to consume more because they are getting some better wages thanks to new green jobs, it will probably destroy the planet in the end. Because the problem is the climate crisis is, so I'm not denying the necessity of massive investment in renewable energies and green kind of technologies and so on. But at the same time, the climate crisis has time limit. We have to reduce, for example, the half of carbon emission in next 10 years. And we also have to decarbonize our entire economy in next 20, 30 years. That means we need a very rapid transition to decarbonize the economy. But the problem is, if you look at the history, economic growth is always characterized by increasing energy and resource consumption. And even we have some green technologies like electric vehicles, for example. Electric vehicles use a lot of resources and energies, and it also requires electricity to drive. So as long as we do not try to reduce at the same time the number of cars on the streets, it will not be sufficiently rapid. So my advocation is basically we need to talk about reducing our consumption and reducing production. That is a basic idea of degrowth. So degrowth is, however, incompatible with capitalism. So I advocate degrowth post-capitalism.
Now, the first thing I think that a lot of people will hear when they hear you say reducing consumption is that is often interpreted as reducing living standards. If you critique a culture of ceaseless production and consumption, and you say, as you do, that we need to slow down, that we need degrowth, what people will interpret that as and portray that as is austerity. You say that our comforts are unsustainable and we need to give them up. And I think the argument will be made that you can't possibly convince people to adopt this because it will make life worse. But you argue that this is a total misinterpretation of what you're actually saying needs to happen. So maybe you'll clear it up for us.
Yes, it's because degrowth is often associated with austerity. We have to give up all the luxuries we have, but not everything, I would say. And we also gain something instead. So here's my explanation. First of all, I'm not saying, as I said, we don't have to give up all the technologies. I explicitly admit we need renewable energies, we need electric vehicles, and these are the things that we need to develop even more. So degrowth is not about going back to nature without any kind of Zoom, computer, iPhone, and so on. But at the same time, we have to question whether we need to buy new iPhone every 2 years. And that's probably excessive. We can repair things and we do, or another question would be, do we really need fast fashion? Do we need so much meat consumption? I'm not saying we should all be vegans immediately, but at the same time, we can start questioning whether our level of consumption might be actually excessive. And there are some people who are actually consuming much more in an excessive way, and people that are super rich. So Gross first advocate reducing economic inequality because the super rich people are not simply exploiting workers, but also they are quite responsible for the current ecological crisis. Top 1% of rich people are responsible for 15% of carbon emissions. So that's something must be reduced. And for example, I advocate banning private jets. Do we really need so many private jets? No, because we never use it. So it doesn't matter even if we use them. We should probably reduce cruise ships, industrial meat production, and these excessive things must be reduced. That's my first proposal. And the second proposal, so even if we give up some of the things, we will have a different kind of abundance. I argue in my book that this is going to be abundance of public goods. In the US, for example, education is commodified. So we have to pay a lot of money to go to university, and students have loans. Also, but we also have to pay a lot for going to doctors. So medical care is privatized and commodified. Public transportation is poor, so we have to buy cars, and we again have to have loans and so on. So our entire economy is commodified. That means that we have to pay for everything, no matter necessary these things are for everyone. So then you need money, and then you have to work harder. But jobs are precarious, low wages, so you work longer hours, and you still don't have enough money, and you have little time to spend with your family and friends, so you're unhappy. So my proposal in the degrowth kind of economy, all those basic services and goods must be decommodified. Education needs to be free. Medical care, public transportation, electricity, these things should be as cheap as possible. And then you don't really have to work so hard. You don't have to worry so much about your housing, future, and education, and so on. And these are the things that you feel much more happy and secure. And that kind of public abundance can actually be realized without constant economic growth. So degrowth aims at kind of a new radical abundance.
You're listening to the Current Affairs podcast from Current Affairs magazine in New Orleans, Louisiana. Current Affairs is a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we depend entirely on reader subscriptions and donations. You'll notice we have no ads, no mattresses, no recruiters, no sports betting. If you can help us in our mission to build independent progressive media, please visit currentaffairs.org/donate to make a donation, or currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine. Thank you so much for supporting our work. Now, back to the program.
So you're talking about, in fact, increasing, as you say, abundance and standard of living while decreasing consumption. And I want to go back to what you said about, you mentioned, buying an iPhone every 2 years, or fast fashion, where your clothes wear out within a few months and you got to get new ones. These are instances where, we might consume more, but if we had clothes that lasted us 20, 30 years, as they can be made to, if we didn't have these things made as commodities where companies had an incentive or needed to keep selling us things, we could consume less and also be better off. And I want to dwell on that because I think that's a paradox for some people. It's certainly a paradox in a world that sees GDP as the measure of social welfare.
Exactly. Degrowth also demands abandoning GDP as a measure of social progress and prosperity, because if you stick to GDP, selling more fast fashion is good for our society because GDP increases and companies make profits and so on. But if you look at the different perspective, for example, the ecological perspective or social well-being perspective, fast fashion really pollutes the entire planet, but also it is often based on the severe exploitation of workers in the global south. And also the consumers are not necessarily happy after buying those clothes, because then you go back to your house and wear it and you feel already bored. So you have to buy new ones all the time. So this is a distinction that Marx actually made: exchange value and use value. The exchange value is represented in GDP, so you sell more and then you gain more wealth and so on. But the use value is that has to do with satisfaction. The fast fashion doesn't really bring your use value because they are simply produced and then wasted and so on and so on. So my advocation is actually the fashion companies needs to reduce the production amount, but they never talk about it because that's again the logic of capitalist companies. Because instead, what do? They talk about recycling. They talk about organic cotton. They talk about some kind of new materials that are more ecologically friendly and so on. But the problem is they produce more of those afterwards. So they end up using more resources and energy, and they pollute the entire planet. So my proposal, as I said, we need to seriously talk about reducing consumption and production, because they are really polluting the entire planet, but they're also not making us happier. So we have clearly different ways of satisfying our desires.
Well, you mentioned Marx, and I want to get to the role of Marx in your book. You also touched on the exploitation of the global south. And this comes up a lot in your book, the imperial mode of living, the way that underneath our consumption in the West is often a vast mountain of exploitation elsewhere that we prefer not to look at, not to see, even though it's a major part of the economic system. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about that first.
Exactly. For example, the reason why I criticize Green New Deal in my book is it could work very well for people and working class in the global north, maybe say in the US. So you produce more cars, you produce more solar panels, you produce other new technologies, and that creates jobs that will probably increase GDP, and that can also reduce the carbon emission. I doubt actually that reduction could happen fast enough, but also we accept that. But even that is not enough, because that kind of discourses ignore the global inequality between the global north and south. Where do all the resources come from in order to produce electric vehicles? Lithium, cobalt, nickel, and these rare metals are often located in the global south. So what's happening right now, already happening, and that what will accelerate in the coming decades under the name of green transformation will be probably and most likely the massive exploitation and extraction of resources in the global south, in Latin America, Africa, China, Russia. All these places will be massively destroyed as a result. The indigenous people's life, ecological system, biodiversity, deforestation, all these things will accelerate, and also accompanied by things like child labor, excessive exploitation, severe working conditions, and so on. That is carried out under the name of ecological transformation, or SDGs. That I would say critical, right? So it simply could basically accelerate a different kind of imperial domination by the global north, the global south. And I think if we really have to overcome that kind of injustice and inequality, the people or the government or the society in the global north have to think about reducing the number of cars, because resources are limited, and those things must be produced somehow. Then we have to give up that kind of excessive consumption and production after all.
Now, I want to ask you about what alternative ways of measuring progress there might be. I feel like one reason that GDP persists is because it's kind of easy. It's easy to see the line going up and say society is getting better off. You're talking about degrowth, but degrowth doesn't just mean It certainly doesn't mean we just want GDP to go down instead of up. That's not what we're talking about. How do you, if you supplant the traditional measures of success and economic well-being, what instead do you pursue? What do you move towards, and how do you know that you're moving towards it?
Yeah, there are many discussions about replacing GDP with a new measure, and that's not coming simply from the heterodox economic side, but the mainstream economics like Joseph Stiglitz also very critical of GDP, and many people, for example, propose measures such as genuine progress indicator or human development index, and these measures actually put emphasis on education, equality, and also the environmental sustainability. So the simple example would be if you destroy the planet, you can measure that by ecological footprint and the carbon footprint and these things. Then you subtract those amount from GDP. So the US economy is obviously the largest GDP from today's calculation. But if you actually subtract the ecological impact from GDP, US ranking goes down because US is also the biggest polluter of the world in terms of environment. But we can also add other measures about equality. So US will further go down because the US economy is characterized by enlarging economic gaps and so on. So looking from this perspective, it's interesting because the US is, as I said, the biggest GDP, but at the same time, so many people died during the COVID. So the higher GDP doesn't necessarily mean good medical system. So your GDP is actually wasted because Japan, which was much more protective from the consequences of economic pandemic, means that Japan is smaller in terms of GDP, but they have better ways of protecting people from the pandemic. So it means that US GDP is wasted. So looking from the different perspective, we can actually many people in Japan, however, complain that the Japanese economy is stagnating and Germany became number 3 and then Japan ranked down. So they actually worry that the Japan is simply becoming a smaller country. But I advocate in Japan a different kind of narrative. Look at your society. Japan is very safe. Japan has very good transportation system. Japan has clean air, many forests. Japan has good food, good anime, cartoons, and these things
culture.
Are not.
You have culture.
Yeah, culture. These things are not necessarily reflected in GDP.
Right.
Even if Japan is going down in terms of GDP, because we have smaller population now and innovation is stagnating, indeed, that's something to lament. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we are losers. We have different things. These are not simply reflected in GDP. So why don't Japanese people invent new measures? And that's something what I advocate to politicians, and maybe something will come out in the next 10 years or so.
Yeah. Well, this is interesting because, you read news stories about Japan's economy, or the way these things are framed are often, well, you use the word stagnate, or the idea that there's so much growth but then it slowed down and now it's stagnant and the country is, it's getting older. The way these framed like a country is failing, but as you point out, there's a lot of richness in Japan. And if you look at different aspects, you could, in fact, say that you're doing very well, and everything depends on what you're kind of looking at. So you draw our attention to the way that I take it like we choose how to measure what exactly the good society is, or what a good society has and what a bad society has.
Exactly. We have valuation system, and we usually value what is measured by money and GDP. But what I advocate in my book is re-evaluation of value. And this is what Karl Marx is trying to do. His immanent critique of capitalism is about, are we really free? Are we really equal? If you look at the market exchange, it looks like that. But if you really look at the production sphere, there is a lot of exploitation, there is inequality, unfreedom, and so on. And the capitalism creates massive wealth, and it is associated with growth. But from the ecological perspective, it is often accompanied by destruction of our planet. But it is also from the perspective of global south, it is accompanied by imperial, colonial exploitation and destruction of indigenous life and so on. So if you really look from a different perspective, the development of capitalism looks also very different. It is actually the regress to more barbarous stages of life. And this is actually happening. So why don't we reevaluate? Why don't we put more importance on well-being, equality, and not necessarily massive consumption of fast fashion, iPhone, and the technology. But Japan, again, the politicians are obsessed with growth, and they're trying to introduce new technologies and nuclear fusion, carbon capture and storage, and the AI. All these things could be invented and introduced to society, but there's no guarantee that introduction of these technology could reinforce the domination by capital, could increase economic inequality. So that means it could increase our unfreedom and inequality in the long run. So, technology will not save us automatically. So we should also talk about slowing down a little bit, because the acceleration in the last 30 years under neoliberal globalization didn't make many of us happy. It's simply making the life more miserable.
Well, and I take this to be a kind of fundamental part of your, what you call degrowth communism, your perspective, which is that, as you mentioned, there are plenty of, you don't even have to be a particularly heterodox economist to critique the GDP as a measure of well-being. But where you kind of go further and introduce a kind of radicalism is they say, okay, well, if we start looking at these alternative standards of what constitutes the good, what constitutes well-being, and we think about what it would take to actually achieve these things, we are led to the conclusion that we have to radically transform the system of production. We have to radically transform, we have to decommodify a lot of things. And tell us a little bit more, not just about how we measure the good, but what we have to do to get there.
Exactly. So degrowth is incompatible with capitalism. That's why I advocate the term degrowth communism. Capitalism is a constant system of expansion accompanied by excessive waste of energy and resources. So communism is based on a very different logic, the logic of mutual aid, sustainability, justice, and so on. I understand that communism in many countries has very bad images because of China, Russia, and so on. But I go back to the tradition of socialism and communism in the 19th century, and that has nothing to do with the image of communism and socialism usually established in the 20th century. So looking at the discussion, for example, Karl Marx, he's the most famous one. Looking at that, he doesn't talk about the kind of strong bureaucratic state with undemocratic rule over people's way of life and so on. Rather, he's saying that capitalism is characterized by constant expansion of market exchanges. So everything becomes commodified. And as I said, even if no matter how much you need water, medical care, education, once these things are commodified, these things are only for people with money. This is making our life more precarious, miserable, and increasing the economic inequality and so on. Marx says we need to commodify. We need to make those goods public goods again, common goods again. And so the society based on commodification is capitalism, but the society based on commonwealth, the society based on commodification of social wealth is communism in my sense. So where do we begin? We can begin by, as I said, decommodifying education, decommodifying public transportation, meaning free public transportation, free internet, free public housing. And we can expand, we can imagine the society where many things become decommodified. And no matter what, even, these things are already introduced in Scandinavian countries, Germany, France, and many countries, but they are still capitalism. So we can make that kind of a transition already today, and that's already happening in Europe more. But through decommodification, our way of thinking and our way of behavior will change, because in the US, the tuition is very expensive. So once you graduate from the college, you look for jobs with higher salary, right? So you are already trapped in the logic of capital accumulation. But if you go to college in Germany, tuition is free. So you spend 10 years at the college and then you graduate because it's free. You spend 10 years, but then you just work in the NGO or you just do farming and you just something good for your society. So the way of thinking and the mode of behavior could radically change through decommodification in such a way that we create a sphere of freedom that is independent of the logic of capital accumulation. And it's like, why don't we expand that sphere gradually so that we will have a more anti-capitalist thinking and behavior within capitalism?
You've mentioned Karl Marx. Before we wrap up, I want to get to the fact that you are a scholar of Karl Marx. You've worked on editing his collected works. One of the interesting things that you contribute here is to bring him into the discussion. And I think for some people who understand kind of Marx's basic theory or think they understand it, they would see it as, well, Marx said that, in fact, you had to develop the productive forces of capitalism to the maximum before you could achieve a higher order, which would be communism or socialism, whatever you want to describe it as. And there would be this kind of linear progression where capitalism would flower and then would destroy itself, and then something would come after. And one of the interesting things that you as a Marx scholar have contributed is that by going into his later writings, you've kind of figured out that, well, perhaps you could explain, but I understand it, he was kind of leaving that view behind and seeing that maybe, in fact, you didn't need to develop the forces of capitalism to the maximum because maybe they were just inherently destructive.
Yeah. Later in his life, I argue in my book, Marx became a degrowth communist. So he gave up basically that kind of the productivist idea of progress. With the development of new technologies, the society becomes richer. But the problem is capitalism monopolizes those fruits of new technologies. But once we overcome the private properties and so on, workers can live like capitalists in the socialism, thanks to those new technologies. So the slogan would be private jets for everyone.
Right. Which is something I've heard said. Yeah.
But the problem is, still today, some left-wing people advocate that kind of image or story of progress and revolution. But the problem is exactly that kind of productivist idea created tension or even antagonism with environmental movement. And this is very unfortunate because Marxists or left-wing people and environmentalists are today both trying to challenge capitalism. Capitalism is obviously creating economic inequality and accelerating climate crisis. So they have something in common. The root cause is capitalism. But the problem, because of this productivist image of Marxism, environmentalists are often against learning from Marxist critique of capitalism. That's unfortunate. So I try to overcome this long-lasting antagonism between red and green. And my proposal is basically Marx himself also admitted his earlier failure of falling into a kind of productivist idea. So he consciously changed through learning about colonization, through learning about ecological practices in non-Western countries, and also learning natural sciences very intensively in 1870s and 80s. He corrected his idea that technologies will emancipate us, and he also corrected the higher productive forces would be the only source of abundance. He changed, as I said, the abundance of commonwealth it could be the foundation of new coming society, and that doesn't necessarily require the constant increase of productive forces. For example, education again. Education, abundance of education, abundance of culture doesn't necessarily require the development of super AI or something like that. So we could imagine a very different kind of post-capitalist, post-scarcity society after capitalism. That's what I call degrowth communism, and this is actually coming from Marx. And then I'm trying to propose that both red and green can learn from each other and fight against capitalism together.
Well, and just one final point here, which is that you not only point out that we can and should imagine such an alternative, but not to quote a classic neoliberal phrase, but in some ways, there is no alternative. You point out the different futures that the climate crisis could take us towards. And if we don't manage to, gain these insights and to think about how we can gain control of the forces of production and put them towards human ends, we could be headed for a future that's quite dire. Your book is in many ways hopeful and constructive, but I think that also, especially when you talk about the four futures, it contains a real warning, doesn't it?
Yeah, another scenario would be climate fascism. Now, when the polycrisis accelerates, there will be more conflict, there will be more refugees, there will be more economic inequality. That means that super rich people will probably try to protect themselves. They only care about themselves. So they will abandon the rest of the people, and that will really increase the tension between the few who have and the many who don't have. So that will destabilize the entire social order. And I argue that in my book, that is kind of the non-democratic dictatorship, which I call climate fascism. So in order to avoid this worst scenario, we have to invent a new political imaginary to avoid the catastrophe. And then this is degrowth communism. I think there will be the way that we people in the global north don't have to exploit the people in the global south. There will be a way that we can build much more solidarity with other people. And so I think we have to revive that kind of socialist tradition, because we have lost that kind of post-capitalist imaginary after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And what happened in the last 30 years is simply that we have to work for capitalism. Only economic progress is the way to secure our life and so on, but that didn't work. So my proposal is basically we have to learn from Karl Marx, and this is the idea of degrowth communism.
Well, I hope that our listeners and readers pick up Slow Down, the Degrowth Manifesto, where they can find out more. It will challenge a lot of their preconceptions, I think, no matter where they come from, whether they are a person who is on the neoliberal end of the spectrum or whether they are a leftist, because you do have this, as you've mentioned today, this critique of the Green New Deal. Your work has attracted such a great deal of much-deserved attention in your country of Japan, and it's now being introduced to English language audiences, so we're so excited for that, and we wish you the best of luck in promoting this book. I hope everyone picks it up and engages with the ideas. Professor Kohei Saito of the University of Tokyo, thank you so much for joining us today on Current Affairs.
Thank you so much.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.